middle of the night, bang, beep, beep, beep. You take a bit of weed off, and there was this huge tail. And you just think, oh my God. It was incredible. I was dropping the boilies down on the moss bank, and as they were rolling in, Mary's mate was coming up in the water and taking them off the moss. And I clocked this one coot, looked down, and he kind of watched it go past, and I thought, that's got to be the pug. And he was in the snags, and I got in the margins and splashed about on the surface. 5 minutes later, he was in the snags on the other side of the island in the railway lane. And I thought, right, now it's game on. And there was this big lump on its side, and I thought, Mallins, done it, yes! I caught measles again, and that stick was no longer bent that way, it turned over the other way. And he just looked up at me, and then he kicked and went out the snag. So I get hold of the line, and I start hand lining towards the fish. Suddenly, I caught all the fish in my dreams, and finally that was the Mallins fish, the fish I most wanted to catch. Those fish, that was the very pinnacle of our sport.
Right, sorry to interrupt, but whilst I have your attention, I just want to talk about a couple of things. Firstly, would you please subscribe to our YouTube channel? We would massively appreciate it, and you will stay very much up to date with everything YouTube orientated that we do. Secondly, and as well as asking you for a little favour, we have a little something that might be of interest to you. If you click the link in description or scan the QR code on screen, you will be entitled to 50% off your first 3 months as a Cypography member. And as a Cypography member, you will get access to over 1,000 videos and several other member perks.
What do you feel about those fish?
Well, I think I've certainly got better at farming. We've produced a lot better since then. But I look at some of these, like this fella here, this is now an upper 40, living in Wraysbury, making lots of anglers very happy. So it's amazing to look at the pictures and think, God, look how small they were back then. But yeah, they're a lot bigger now. Unfortunately, some of them are no longer with us. Well, that brings us to the start of the 2002 season. And by this point, I'd caught fish way beyond my wildest dreams, I guess. Mary's mate, Mary. I'd caught, you know, lovely carp. But as I've said before, I really went to Wraysbury desperate to catch Mallins. And I felt when I first went to the lake 3 years before, I thought I would catch Mallins quite quick. It seemed to be the fish that I found. But at the start of 2002, I'd caught amazing carp, but I still hadn't caught Mallins. It was clear that they liked the bait that we're using. So Dave Billett's bait that Ben and I were using, that Ben used to bring up from Devon, the fish were clearly really on it. And where we introduced it regularly around various snags, they'd become quite attuned to feeding on it, and they ate it with real gusto. One really famous fish that we used to see a fair bit, particularly on the 10-acre island snags, was a fish called the king of the fungus mirrors. Now this fish was almost mythical in the time that I was there. People would say, is there such a fish as the king of the fungus mirrors? And the answer was very much a big fat yes. So this fish had this big old scar on its back, and if you went up on the snags or went on the island and crept about, you'd find it over and over again. And it was a big carp, and it had an absolute huge scar halfway down its left side, like it had been hit with an axe. It was, as I've said before, it was probably a heron stabber when it was a little fish. And that fish finally got caught by John Holt, an incredibly skilled angler who was the master at setting traps. And John caught that fish, having, like myself, baited areas and stuff around the snags. He caught that fish, and I remember him saying the hook hole was in the side of its mouth. It's almost like it sucked the rig up and got barged by another fish, and that tightened everything up, and bang, hook in. And John landed. I think it was 36 pound. Anyway, that's not my story to tell really, but yeah, it was definitely there. And that fish went on to become, you know, a really big fish, as some of the older fish that I was fishing for passed on. So my season for 2002 started in July. I started focusing in an area which I've already mentioned and alluded to being a good area for me, was the Railway Lake. So you've got the South Lake, the long stretch of water of the South Lake. Then you've got this 10-acre island, which wasn't 10 acres, but it was a big island, big mature trees. And you've got the Railway Lake. And the Railway Lake was a weedy area. It was sheltered from the big winds, but the fish used to spend a lot of time in there. And it was an area I really got tuned into. So I'd go off in my boat, stash the tackle, and then I'd go up on 10-acre island and I'd feed spots around in the railway lake, but I'd do it from the bank, and I'd make sure I was really sneaky about where I hid spots. And I started to catch a few fish in that area, and that sort of started to build up in the railway lake. I seen more and more fish, and my spots were getting really worked quite hard in that area. And I was doing my best to try and keep everything as quiet as I could. And I got a little bit of a rash of my own stockfish. I had Lucky, I had Sea Scale, and they'd grown. Lucky was now 17, Sea Scale was 18, and then had Sea Scale again, actually out of No Carp Bay at £20, Paw Print. But I kept baiting this area of the railway lake, and I remember the bites seemed to come out the railway lake in the warm afternoons, which made good sense because it was sheltered. The fish would go in there to sun themselves. And one particular afternoon I was sitting in there, I'd set my traps, everything was absolutely perfect. And I remember really well the moment there was some movement in the undergrowth, and I looked round, and this guy called Chris Gardner comes along the path. I didn't know him, I never met him there, and he came in and we passed the time of day, and he said, "I'm Chris." And he'd only been in the swim, as I remembered it, a minute or two, when my middle rod pulled up tight. I leapt on it, and he went, "Is that a bite?" I went, "Yep, see you in a bit." And I went out into the lake, and I played it off the snags, and sort of went out into the lake and was playing this fish. And it was a beautiful, beautiful sunny day. Wraysbury, crystal clear. You could see sort of 15 foot down, all the weed beds, and my line was kiting down into the weed. And slowly you could sort of see this black shape of a fish coming up through the water. And as I played it towards the surface, it was clear that it was a common, and it was giving a really, really good, powerful account of itself. And it was snake back and forth and back and forth. And I looked back to my swim, and Chris Gardner still stood there. And I was thinking, don't come off, talking away to the fish, reminding myself to take my time, not do anything stupid. And the fish got closer and closer to the surface, and you could see this fantastic, almost black common coming up in the water, and put it in the landing net. And it was Jacko's common. And I took it over to the bank, and Chris Gardner was like, "That's incredible, I've only been here a minute and I've seen a Wraysbury carp." I said, "Well, welcome to Wraysbury, Chris." And we got the fish out, and we weighed it and photographed it, and it was £35. And it was certainly one of the sort of real classic one, Jacko's common, absolutely amazing fish. And I think it's still alive today. I think it's going to be a 40-pounder if it is. It was a cracker back then. Another fish which was certainly using the same area at that time was the pug. Now the pug was a fascinating old fish. So in that period, sort of 2000, 2000 and 2002, it was only caught once by John McAllister in the winter out of the edge of the north, not in the edge, but in the corner of the North Lake. And I think if I remember rightly, John had to smash the ice to get his rigs in. It was a real cold water capture. But the pug, or Pugsy, used to have a really odd character. It loved 10-acre island snags, and it used to live in there, and it would sort of root round 10-acre island. So I'd see it quite regularly in the main snags in 10-acre island, which was in the Dredger Bay. But it would also sneak round the end of 10-acre island and go into the railway lake side. And I could see my way to a capture if I could keep it there and feed it there. So I really concentrated. I'd seen Mallins there too, but I was thinking I haven't caught the pug, and this is a chance. So I started feeding the railway lake area more and more, and on a couple of occasions the pug had been in the bay, and I'd seen it with other fish, and I caught the little linear at 17. I caught measles again at 26. That's my third capture of measles. Famous old Wraysbury carp. But when you start to get your third repeat catch, you're like, come on, who was down there with you at that moment when you took the rig? Anyway, I catch measles again, but I knew the pug was into this routine, and he was definitely feeding in my area. Now, on the particular trip, this is now in September, I sort of clocked what was going on, and I sort of baited my spots, but the pug was back in the main Dredger Lake Bay snags. And I was like, okay, that's not ideal. So I got in my chest waders, and I got in the margins of the Dredger Lake snags, and I spooked him out. And I don't think it was probably ethically the right thing to do, but I decided at the time it was. And he was in the snags, and I got in the margins and splashed about on the surface, and he just looked up at me, and then he kicked and went out of the snags. Sure enough, 5 minutes later, he was in the snags on the other side of the island in the railway lake, and I thought, right, now it's game on. And I put a bit of bait in from the island, and he literally straight away took it. I thought, well, he's not upset by the fact that he's been interfered. And I set my traps up, and nothing happened that night. The next morning, it was all quiet, so I redid the rods about 10 o'clock in the morning. And bite time seemed to be around midday. And I'm sitting there, and I watched a pair of coots come out from the snags I was fishing across. So it's about 90 yards, something like that, across to the snags. And there, I say snags, these big overhanging trees. And I'd cleared a big area sort of around where I perceived it to be a bit dangerous, but it was quite a good clear run up to the spot. And this pair of coots came out. And you could hear the coots clicking away to each other and squeaking. And I clocked this one coot, looked down, and I thought, he's definitely watching something on the bottom. He just, you could see his head turn, and he kind of watched it go past. And I thought, that's got to be the pug. And I thought, he's eaten loads of that bait now. He's definitely got a taste for it. And I thought, surely. And I thought, here we go. And I was just sat there on my rods, and the bite came, bang, game on, fish on, just put some pressure on the reel. And it just came back, 2 or 3 pumps, and it kicked 2 or 3 pumps later, and it was just going up and down in front of me in the railway lake. And I went out in the boat, and usual routine now, well-oiled routine, out in the boat, hard bottom boat at this point, so nice and stable, landing net behind me, and I'm playing this fish. And again, a beautiful sunny afternoon, and the pictures show that. The light was, bright, and I'm looking down, and clear as a bell, there was the big, deep shape, mirror side. It was the pug. And there he was, and I remember just putting the pressure on. I had my Polaroids on because I'd been looking sort of across towards the sun at the spot. And as I put the pressure on, you could just see the weed fronds sort of just opening up, like the hands, just letting it go. And the fish came up in the water, and then we're back in open water. It's plodding up and down, plodding up and down. Bear in mind, at this point, I don't think he'd been caught for 18 months. And, he's pretty special as a Wraysbury original, or one of the bigger Wraysbury A-team. And I'm playing him, and he's getting closer to the surface. And without too much fuss, sunk the landing net, and he went in. And I knew exactly which fish it was. He was unmistakable, the shape of him. He's blind in one eye, had a little wart on his lip, and you couldn't mistake it. So in the landing net, I knew I'd caught the pug. So I motored my way slowly back to the swim and got set up to do the pictures. And to sort of be there and see that old fish, another Wraysbury A-team, was absolutely fantastic. And I knew I was getting them. They were really on my bait. I'd fed a lot of it by this point, and it was very exciting fishing. And I just felt if I could find Mallins, I had every chance. But that was kind of the end of that spell. I remember it almost was like it clicked a bit. Then I caught the pug. He'd been living in that sort of routine of round 10 Acre Island, and my spots dusted over. I remember going back the next week, and there was a few leaves on the bottom, and I thought, nothing's been here since I caught that fish. They've gone off. And I was chatting to Phil Jackson, Jacko, and he said, Scotty, you're a bit of a one-trick pony. You only ever catch them out the railway lake. And it really stung. I was like, a bit vicious. Anyway, the following week, I couldn't find any fish. As I said, the railway lake looked dead, but it's still quite nice weather. And I was out, it's early October by this point, I was out in the North Lake, and I was just drifting along, looking down through my glass bottom bucket. And there were these huge stands, like cathedrals of weed, reaching right up towards the surface of hornwort. Funny plant, hornwort. It doesn't grow any roots on the bottom. It just sort of sits on the sediment and comes upright. But by late summer, it's formed these massive, great sort of spires of weed coming up, like coming out of 15, 16, 18 foot of water virtually to the surface. And it looks almost really architectural with a light on it. It looks very beautiful under the water. And as I'm drifting along looking at these big corridors between these huge banks of weed, I see a fish slide past under the boat, and I thought that was a fish. And I went a little bit further, and I saw another one. So I dropped a cork marker float over the side, it unravelled and settled. And I drifted back round, went in a big semicircle, went back, and I drifted over the same area towards my float, and there was another fish. So I dropped another cork, and I went back to the giant footsteps swim, and I got myself a bit organised. Thought, right, I found them. Now, I was aware that the bait was definitely working, but something that I had noticed that most people weren't doing at Wraysbury at that point was using bright pink pop-ups. And I had been playing about with them a little bit at other lakes. And Colin Davison and I had talked about it, and he tried them, and I thought these work really well. And Frank Warwick was a pioneer of the sort of bright pink pop-ups, and everything in my DNA was saying, well, you want to use a brown fish meal. But actually, do you? Sometimes, is it worth trying something different? Bear in mind, these Wraysbury fish had been fished for a fair bit, and it was now late summer, we're into October time. So I decided to fish with little bright pink pop-ups, and I'd come up with a bit of a cunning plan. So I could actually pre-bait with bright pink pop-ups, individuals. I knew the bottom of that lake at this point really, really well. I spent a lot of time tracking her back and forth and looking down at the bottom. So what I used to do is use my little metallic bait dropper, and I'd get a little tiny pink pop-up on a bit of dental floss and a little bit of split shot, and I'd drop it on one of their little patrol routes. And I could check it a day or two or a week later and see if it had moved. Now, I'd done this a little bit and it had proved successful. But as I said, I've been in the railway lake doing some fishing there. But I came out and I'd seen these fish and I thought, well, the pink pop-ups I'd put in had gone. So I thought, well, we'll try it. Anyway, I fished with 3 rods out in this zone, and it was significant because I had a guy called Mark Bennett down to my right, and his little boy, and who was also called Mark. And Mark Bennett and Mark Shave were great friends. Anyway, I'd sort of got to know Mark Bennett, and he seemed a really nice guy, and his little chap, his little son, was a lovely kid. And so he'd come into my swim a bit during the weekend rather, and we chatted. And anyway, I managed to catch a couple of stocky commons out in that area on single bright pink pop-ups. And of course, every time you think you're going to be playing Mallins, and every time up become this fantastic looking carp, but at mid-20, but still good to get bites. But I've got a nice photo in my album of Mark Bennett's son, little Mark Bennett, with me holding this fish. And yeah, it's a nice memory because unfortunately, Mark Bennett Sr. and Mark Shea went on to drown the following winter in the lake. So yeah, it had a sad ending, but it was nice to spend a little bit of quality time with his boy. I often wonder what he's up to now. So that was the North Lake. A couple of weekends later, we're now into mid-October. I couldn't find fish in the North Lake. I spent all day. I'd gone. It was the 11th. It was Friday, the 11th of October, and I'd spent the whole day looking for fish. Got there early. I had no teaching on a Friday, and I told Sean, my boss, because it was my birthday, I was going to go and do a spot of research. And I'd headed off and been at Wraysbury all day. Light was reasonably good, but there was a ripple. Spent all day hunting, not found any fish. And then right at the end of the day, I was in an area long range off Bryant's Point, fishing across towards the sailing club, just drifting along with my head in the bucket, just looking down for hours and hours, just cruising along with the outboard on one click. And I saw a shape beneath the boat, another shape, and I thought, okay, there's a clue. I dropped the same routine, dropped a little cork marker float. It unravelled and settled on the surface, and I just started doing circles around the spot. And I could see in amongst the weed, different sort of weed in this area, not the same hornwort, but just low-lying weed. But there were odd clear spots, humps and bumps. And there was one area I thought that looks good for a bite. And there was just a little bit of broken gravel and a bit of sand. I thought, well, we'll put one rig there. So I dropped a couple of floats, went back to the bank, back to Bryant's Point, and I put all my gear in the edge. As I've already alluded to, I was worried about having my kit nicked again. Got it all set up, got the rods ready, and I went out and I dropped. I thought, well, it's cold. Just literally fish with 3 single hook baits. So I went out to the spot and I dropped a single pink pop-up on that little bit of broken ground. I went about 20 yards to the right, I found another little strip and dropped another single pink pop-up, both on 8-ounce clock leads out there. And then I found a little area to the right, sort of about 50 or 60 yards out, and I'd put a little single pop-up out there. And this was an area I had some of my little pre-baited pink pop-ups disappear from, so I felt I was fairly confident out there. Anyway, that was the Friday afternoon, got all the traps set, and yeah, I'm feeling fairly confident of a bite. And the next morning, literally, I don't know, 10 o'clock, it wasn't exactly the crack of dawn, 10 o'clock, the long range rod out to the left, pulled up tight, hop in the boat. And yeah, it was a very exciting moment because Ben had we'd been having a beer to celebrate my birthday, and Ben had been in the swim the evening before, and he was about, and he photographed me going out to play this fish. Anyway, we get out there and the wind had picked up a little bit, and I'm playing this fish and it's all going according to plan until the point that I get the fish up on the surface. Now the wind was causing me some problems, so what I would do, I sort of got the fish up at the back of the boat and I clicked the outboard off, and as soon as I clicked the outboard off, I was drifting away and I was having to give the fish some lines, so the wind was pushing me off towards the Route Nightmare swim. So it would have been blowing westerly. And it was pushing me across the surface. And I was thinking, this is tricky. So I had another go, and I thought, well, I had this, what seemed like a brilliant idea at the time, but it was obviously a complete ridiculous idea. I'd leave the outboard running one clip to hold position. So I play this fish up to the surface. Now at this point, I could clearly make out it was the pug again, 3 weeks after its previous slip up in the railway lake. 4 weeks after its previous slip up in the road. I'm playing this fish and up comes the pug, and at this point it's thinking, for God's sake, can we put an end to this fight and net me? So I put my landing net in the edge of the water and I bring the pug towards it, and of course at that second my landing net has a life of its own. It literally ripped out my hand, flipped round in 2 somersaults and disappeared over the side of the boat. And I'm in complete confusion at this point. What's happened? Well, of course, the obvious thing had happened. I'd put my landing net in at the back of the boat right beside the prop that was spinning round, and it had grabbed hold of my landing net and flipped it out of my hand. So there's a moment on the 12th of October, I'm right out in the middle of the South Lake playing, obviously, the pug again. I had to open the bail arm, lift the outboard up and start untangling what the remains of my landing net, which had been shredded by my outboard. And the pug obviously getting quite bored of the whole scenario at this point, kicks and just disappears. And as I'm just drifting away, the line's going off the spool like they turn. I'm thinking, this isn't going very well. And I could hear Ben in the distance on the end of Bryant's Point roaring with laughter. "You chuffing noddy, have you ever done this before?" I was thinking, well, if I hadn't landed the pug previously, I would have been very stressed at this point. Anyway, I got the landing net sorted. Wound my way back for like what seemed like the second round of the fight with the pug, got way upwind of him, got him to the surface, put the landing net, was held together just about enough, sunk the net, got it in the thing, and got back to the swim from an absolute barrage of abuse from Ben, who was telling me I was an absolute noddy and had never caught a carp before. Anyway, there it was, the pug again, a £40 fall. So yeah, caught the pug twice within a month at £40 plus both times. So chuffed to catch it again, but at the same time, like, what else was down there? That was the end of that trip pretty much, except the next morning I did have another bite, and that came off the short range spot, which was a really weird fish called the minnow, which was a little common of about £15, and that took the single pink pop up as well. It fell for that trap. And I'm playing that thinking, you know, what's this going to be? And it was come up. It was a reasonably straightforward fight, £15, but another fish. So, I mean, I finished the season. That was the last bite I had. I did go back the next weekend and no more fish were forthcoming, but I'd had 12 in 2002. So I felt like I was really stacking them up. And 12 fish in a season by today's standards, crikey. Amazing anglers catch 12 in an afternoon now, and they're all massive. But at that point, to catch 12 fish from Wraysbury, even with some of them being the little stockies that I'd introduced myself, I felt like I was going well. But I remember having a conversation with Ben that winter. What are you going to do next season? I was like, Ben, I've got to keep going. I've got to keep going. I've lost a couple. And I feel like I've just got to catch Mallins. That has to be the last fish in the set. I can't finish. I don't mind not catching the king of the fungus mirrors or baby Mary, but I felt I wanted to catch Mallins, so that was the reason to go back for one more year. So 2003, well, as I've alluded to, chatting with Ben, what are you going to do? You're going to keep going? I was like, I've got to keep going until I catch Mallins. So the year started, my great friend Ben was organising the World Carp Classic in France, and myself, I helped with him a role at Spa. We took some students over to help marshal it. And while I'm there, I got chatting to Colin Davidson, who was in a partnership with Viv, fishing as a team. There were pairs of anglers dotted all around Villadon. And I got chatting to Colin, and he basically said, look, Scotty, I'm working with this company called Ocean Fresh. And I've made this bait called Red October. Would you like to try it? And he had some there at Villadon. He said, look, how much? You can have as much as you want. And I was like, how much is as much as you want? He said, honestly, Scotty, you can have as much bait as you want. And this would have been probably early spring, maybe April time, something like that from memory. And I went, wow, okay. And I chatted with Ben about it. And I'd been using the same fish meal bait, from Dave Billett's bait from Devon for 2 years at Wraysbury, and my catches had gone up and up. And it was clear that fish like the pug, like the king of the fungus mirrors, loved the bait. But to have the opportunity to not be, I was paying for that bait, and Colin was like, it'll be free. You can have as much bait as you want for free. And at that point in my fishing, I didn't get much for free at that stage. I might have got the odd packet of hooks, but that was about it. And I might have blagged a quart of lead or two at that point as well. But it was largely quite expensive to be stoving in bait, you know, tipping kilos and kilos of bait in to feed the fish, to try and get that confidence in them so that when they're out in the lake and they find it, they wolf it down. And Colin's like, honestly, Scotty, as much as you like. I'm like, okay, let's try that. So when he got back from the World Carp Classic at Villadon, I drove back up to Soham and I met with Colin at the factory, and he said, you know, how much do you want? And I think, if memory serves me right, I only had a little Renault 5 Prima at that point, and it was so heavy to the ground, it took me a long time to get back, and I didn't think I got above 40 miles an hour all the way.